It's an honor. It's a privilege being here. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to forego introductions. I think we could spend probably at least an hour introducing each panelist here. It's a wealth of information and expertise. I'd like to go alphabetically down the road here or down the line. And I want to raise a question. I'm glad we're starting with education because it is, after all, a foundation, and it is a field in which we are seeing not just change, but also enormous challenges children face these days, especially those in our poorest communities. So I'm going to ask Dr. John Gabrielli, first of all, how often do our debates about education reform, school improvement, totally miss the point because we ignore the science and the research that's out there? In my experience, I think most educators are pretty clueless about the kind of research, the kind of changes that we're seeing. Dr. Gabrielli, what's your answer to that?
Well, first I want to thank Dr. Chapman for the chance to participate in this remarkable program. I think the dialogue between science and education has been a challenging one. Educators have an immediate mission, which is to help the children in front of them, the students in front of them. Researchers have another mission, which is to collect objective information as carefully as possible. And those two things often are, as with the same thing as in medical research, tough to pull together. And I think the exciting thing that's happening now is there's much more progress in careful scientific research intersecting with educational environments, but I think that hasn't been historically true, and it's just a recent step forward.
Dr. Gamino, when I go into schools, and if there are parents here who go into their children's schools, we often find that teachers are ill-equipped to understand how children really learn. We'd like to believe that they have access to all the information they need, especially if we're dealing with kids with a euphemism, so-called at risk. In your experience, why isn't that information getting to those teachers?
I think there's a great gap in what educators understand about the brain, and I think it's very important that we bridge that gap. There are some organizations that are trying to do that, but it hasn't been very effective. Teachers need to know that what they're actually doing is changing the brains of these children, not just teaching them. And the importance of getting them to interact and to be involved in the learning is crucial for successful education.
Dr. O'Brien, you're someone who is very familiar with schools and the role of the arts and music. It would seem to me that that would be a great point of access for teachers to experiment with real learning, with the kind of learning that kids enjoy versus the more academically driven curricula, and really explore what children are capable of.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're touching on there is intrinsic motivation, and I think that's an emerging area of focus for research that a lot of people are interested in.
For the layperson, what is intrinsic motivation?
Well, intrinsic motivation is sort of what spurs a kid to want to do something. So, and I think that has been a theme that's been coming up in a lot of arts-based education research in terms of how you really engage a young person to think deeply and to care about what it is they're hearing and to be able to connect the dots on why that matters to them. So even in, for example, if you look at the National Science Foundation review criteria, they have intellectual merit and broader impact. And it's sort of like how that intelligence is not just absorbed, but absorbed in a way that actually means something and resonates and then becomes part of your long-term memory.
Dr. Saxberg, Dr. Doggett was talking about all these initiatives and policies by this and former administrations. Let's say in the instance of Head Start. Head Start has come under an enormous amount of scrutiny because, as President Obama has suggested, many of these programs aren't functioning. What do we need to do to better or improve the focus on disadvantaged children, children in poverty? Make the connection there to what we need to explore in terms of the brain development, their capacity, their ability to learn.
I think one of the challenges in the way we think about these problems is that we attack them through what has been easy to detect rather than what the real problems are. So it's relatively easy to tell that a child is poor, or the race of a child, or what school they're in. What's harder, and is actually more effective, is to understand what is not already baked into long-term memory for those kids. So if I could just take a second to talk a little bit.
Please.
I'm going to give you all a master's degree in cognitive science in about, 60 seconds. Okay, so breath in, breath out, there won't be a quiz. Cognitive scientists, as they look at how expertise works, find we have very narrow working memory, which is the conscious talky parts of our minds. Can't do very many things at once. You've often heard about how you can't hold more than 5 or 6 numbers in your head at once. So that's working memory. It does the hardest, most important things that we have to do. And working memory is supported by what's called long-term memory, which is huge, rapid, very fluent, almost invisible to our own mind. So let me just try a little experiment with you. Raise your hand if you drive a car. See, I tried this in Singapore. It was a disaster. Okay. Okay. So raise your hand if the following has ever happened to you. You set out driving to place A, and then you're thinking about DC and life and the world, and you look up and you're at place B. Raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. Raise your hand, look around. You're not crazy, at least not for that reason. Okay, so we just laugh and say, oh gosh, I did that again, and we go to the right place. What we don't think enough about is who drove you to place B? Who was in charge of a ton of metal moving at maybe 50 miles an hour? You were busy doing something else, right? So who's in charge? And cognitive scientists find that this is the nature of expertise, that you build complex decision-making capabilities into long-term memory that happen rapidly and fluently. And that is just as true of a small child trying to learn to read as it is a doctor trying to become good at doing diagnostics, right? So as we think about the visible characters of students of all ages and how that correlates with problems in learning performance, what cognitive science and brain science are starting to let us do is get under the hood. Just like in medicine, the visible problem is high blood pressure. The goal is not to bring out leeches to drop your blood pressure, right? Something else is going on that we need to find out. And I think this is the real opportunity now coming up over the next set of years, is to use cognitive measures of brain function as well as measures of mastery to understand what is really in the way of student learning. Sorry, that was a long answer, but
No, not at all. I mean, I learned something. I think I remember driving from Tucson, Arizona to Flagstaff, and in those 5 hours, I'd never realized how I got there.
Yeah.
Has Dr. Saxberg, or has anybody on this panel, said anything that you all dispute, have a different view on? I want to get a sense of whether we're kind of preaching to the choir, or whether there's any real, maybe dissent is a real strong, whether there's any real disagreement among people who are doing this kind of research. Any?
No, not so much.
Hey, you're safe. Great. You reminded me of this ongoing debate about the number of words that children learn by preschool or first grade. What is it, 30 million? 30 million words. And when you were speaking about our long-term or short-term memory, I'm wondering how children are affected, given their age, by how they're exposed to vocabulary, to numbers, to problem solving. There's an assumption that the poorest children in this country are terribly prepared for school because they aren't exposed. Is that a given? Is that a fundamental problem that we have with kids who begin school unready to learn? I'll invite anyone who wants to take that on.
I guess there's just one thing that occurs to me, and this is sort of an association that I'm making in terms of some of the most seminal arts education research has to do with how it closes gaps for stressed populations. So, in other words, there was a Champions of Change was something, and this is over a decade old now, but there was 25,000 people that were tracked longitudinally. And the thing that really popped out was that kids from underserved or stressed areas who were involved in arts seem to close the performance gap. So there seems to be something there that would indicate that if maybe they're not getting enough words, this allows them to sort of start working through some of what they missed.
And I think it's unfair to say that children aren't ready to learn. We are born to learn. And so it's very important that children receive intervention, whether it's early on, of course is important, but even further in middle school, they need additional intervention to help them with thinking skills.
But that's the issue, that they're not receiving that help. That's what we're up against.
To some degree. But I think parents need to know that there are simple things even poor parents can do. They can read to their children. We have access to library cards that, reading doesn't cost anything. They can play simple games with their children to help make them more prepared to understand problem solving and numerology and things like that.
I want to come back to that. It occurred to me, Dr. Gabrielli, that at MIT you run into, and you certainly deal with, incredibly gifted, talented young people. What made them that way? What was it about their brain, their development, that put them in the position to be able to function the way they do at an incredibly good institution like MIT?
So, a lot of students at MIT, a dream job for them is to go to Google, because not for everybody, but
To work at Google.
So let me
Right.
work that way. So Tom Friedman had a couple of columns recently in the New York Times talking to the head of human resources at Google and saying, what do you look for people coming out of college? And he said, we look for not content knowledge, but we look for the ability to learn and problem solving. And so that's not been a part of the curriculum in schools as an explicit way to teach. Naturally, schools have wanted to teach children how to read, how to do math. That's been their job. That's what we've asked of them. But we realize that especially in children who are not coming from highly supported environments, those other kinds of skills of broad learning and problem solving don't come naturally. So if I could have my minute to tell you about a study that we did with the Boston public school system, where we saw about 1,500 eighth graders in inner city schools, and we knew both their state test scores, the so-called high stakes test scores that states give. In Massachusetts, it's called the MCAS. And we were also given the opportunity, and this is what's different, to go under the hood, as you described so nicely, to measure working memory capacity, processing speed, fluid reasoning, the kinds of mental, nimble skills that we all want to have to solve modern day problems at a high level. And what we found is this: which school you went to really influenced your test scores. That mattered. Better schools did a better job in terms of affecting test scores. But which school you went to had no influence at all in terms of these cognitive skills that are lifelong skills for problem solving and learning to learn. So we know that they're not a byproduct of even the best of public school education. What they are is something that needs to be taught in a different and explicit way. And that's, I think, an exciting research agenda that we now have, strong information and some approaches that you might hear about from my colleague to really help children learn problem-solving skills that will apply broadly to the modern world.
So if not the school, where? The family?
I think the schools can do it. I think family can be important, but I think a curriculum that directly addresses the ability to solve complex, novel problems, and not only content knowledge of mathematics and reading, but also how to be mentally nimble, have a big working memory capacity. Mm-hmm. Those are things that we're increasingly thought was dictated by sort of your genes at birth or your environment at birth, and there's just more and more evidence that the right kind of intervention at school, after school, supplementary programs can make a tremendous difference in endowing children with these gifts.
Dr. Saxberg.
So John mentioned earlier this mismatch between the scientists and the educators. And what you're getting at, I think, is a completely missing profession in education, right? So we all know what chemical engineers are, right? We know they're not chemists, but we know that chemical engineers are deeply embedded and enmeshed in chemistry. And we also know chemical engineers have to worry about a lot more stuff. They got health regulations, they got safety regulations, and they have new problems caused by scale, right? Big pipe in the ceiling, is that going to break? Mm-hmm. The chemists in laboratories, their pipes never break. They got little pipes. They don't have to worry about that, right? So a chemical engineer, while steeped in the current chemistry, hoping it will solve some of the really hard problems, also has to draw from other areas. Where are our learning engineers? Right? Where are our learning engineers? Imagine if you were going to build a new biotech manufacturing facility And, you know, he comes to me and says, so can you help me design it? And I say, yes, phlogiston theory is perfect for this. And he's looking at me like, well, what about the whole like molecules and biology? And it's like, no, I'm good with phlogiston. It's worked since the Middle Ages. I'm very comfortable with it. I've heard about molecules, but that's not what I do, right? Now, in chemical engineering, he would leave and find somebody who knows something about the science, right? What's so interesting in learning is we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to ask, are you drawing on modern learning science to help us? And to realize that there is this new thing, which is how do we do what you were just suggesting at scale? There's a real engineering challenge of taking ideas from a lab and bringing them out to work at scale. And part of it is interpretation. Some of the research findings are narrow and deep, and just like in any science and practical stuff, you have to integrate all these. And that's very hard for educators to do because they're right there on the front lines. So there's a miss.
So this sort of comes back to, you'd mentioned Laszlo Bock, who's the Google hiring guru. This was also in a recent article, reflected in a recent article in Fast Company, Ed Catmull at Pixar. And both of them talk about something else. It was also in the Tom Friedman article about the need to develop these sort of genius teams that work well together. Some people bring in certain expertise on a certain thing and others in something else. But the key thing that they find is the biggest challenge is something I think Laszlo Bock called intellectual humility. So understanding when you step forward and say, I have the answer for this and I'm passionate about it and I have an opinion, but somebody else then says, but what about this? That person's ability to go, oh, never mind, or let me shift that, that's the thing that both the brain trust at Pixar and the way they build teams at Google is that sort of talent that is a real challenge to think about how you develop.
Well, we've done that fairly successfully at the Center for Brain Health. We've reached over 20,000 students in the last 5 years through training teachers to get kids to start thinking at a deeper level.
So these are learning engineers we're talking about?
Yes,
Kind of.
so to speak, yes.
Dr. Gabrielli talked about that study in Boston and mentioned testing. There was I don't know if Dr. Chapman coined this or not, somewhere in the literature that I was reading, is that we're wired to be inspired versus too tired to be inspired. And it reminded me of the story that we're completing this week. A colleague and I, we visited with some local high schools, and it's a story about testing. Are we testing our kids too much? Well, it just so happens that when I asked these kids that, they said, yeah, I think I take at least 60, maybe 70 tests, standardized tests, tests with consequences every year. That kind of blew me away. In relation to this conversation, I do wonder whether this barometer we call testing says anything about brain development. Do we know what our testing, whether it's the SAT, whether it's a state test, whether it's a county or a district test at the end of every semester to see if these kids are learning what they're supposed to be learning? Does that measure anything that we're talking about?
No, usually not. I think we're trying to get there with the Common Core to get kids to think deeply about information, but in general, most standardized tests, you can answer A, B, C, or D. It really doesn't take thinking skills. And
so why are we doing it, is my question. Why do we think that this somehow is a way to gauge our kids' intelligence?
Oh, go ahead.
The merit of any test depends on the details of the test itself, right? So as my students always will point out to me, who don't do as well as they might on a test, So that's always going to. And that's a big topic with different tests. I think that for the one study I was involved in Massachusetts, I think it does matter if a child has a good vocabulary and the state knows whether school is boosting that. I think it does matter if a child can do core mathematical operations. So those are things that these kinds of ABCD tests can verify. But clearly we know that all the other things we talked about today, from intrinsic motivation, passion, teamwork, the cognitive skills that let people nimbly learn through life, We know those tests don't measure that. And in fact, I don't think they were ever meant to do that. We're in a new era where we ask many people to have these kinds of mental abilities to succeed in a new world. And so it's our jobs to somehow develop this education engineering environment. And then we need the right kinds of measures, which are not the ones we've historically given.
I might add to that a little bit because, again, if you think about medicine, we've evolved over decades a pretty healthy relationship between what is going on and test data, right? So physicians, we all know this, physicians are not supposed to treat the test data. That example with the blood pressure stuff. That doesn't mean you ignore blood pressure. It means there are real things going on you can't see that are causing changes in evidence. And somehow in education, because a lot of this very systematic focus on testing is actually fairly recent, you'll hear school superintendents say, my problem is low test scores. We've got to get them up. Now, in fact, the problem is the kids don't know any math, right? And the test score is just the evidence. Psychometricians who study testing and learning and have done this for decades, what they've actually concluded is it's actually very dangerous to identify a single measure to use for this kind of work. Because then everyone crowds in to optimize that measure.
Yep.
And a single piece of evidence is never good enough to help you guide something as complex as learning. What you need is multiple lines of evidence, right? So we want our kids to build skills, whether they're writing skills, communication skills, analytic skills. Well, let's triangulate multiple sets of data rather than give me the one number I need to make higher. That's really dangerous in any setting. I mean, whether it's Congress or learning. So, and so I think that's one of our challenges with testing, is to pull back from thinking our tests are our problems and use them as noisy evidence of what we really need to get after.
Dr. O'Brien.
Yeah, so I think this is a good segue into something we talked about in our planning call, in STEM focus, and then this push to expand it. Sometimes it's referred to as STEAM, or STEM plus design thinking, or STEM plus creativity. And I think when you look at that, the STEM push, or the intrinsic motivation within a number of fields to try to increase our STEM scores, in some ways was driven by PISA tests and other markers that started to raise legitimate concern that we may not be competing in these skills internationally as well as we want to be.
TIMS as well.
Yes, right, exactly. So we see other countries performing better in these tests, and oh my God, we got to do something. So one of the things that then happens over a few years is that those types of skills are measurable in ways that you can't measure these other things that are now emerging as some of the most important core competencies of the 21st century. So it's not just Google and Pixar, but the National Research Council, Education for Life and Work, talked about creativity and innovation as being key. So I think what's driving this, there's a STEAM congressional caucus, there's a STEM for STEAM movement, there's a STEAM Connect movement. And I think part of that is this sense that we, just as we're beginning to understand that these are really important skills and that we're not tracking them the way that we track STEM, that we're not adjusting and trying to react to this STEM problem by accidentally snuffing out these things that we've just begun to understand are important for our future.
And we know that the best researchers, the best engineers, the best designers, they really are using creative processes, design thinking, and so forth. And so it's a mistake to kind of distort our thinking into a single measure, whether it's a piece of problem solving or state tests.
Right.
That we need to have that more comprehensive view of what do the best experts decide and do out there, and then pull the whole thing back. And I think that's where the arts work can be very powerful.
We're halfway through our presentation, and just a reminder, there will be a chance for you to ask questions. As was mentioned, there are some microphones set up, so be thinking about that. No speeches, by the way, just questions. Let's talk about brain health. And two things come to mind. There's a discussion, certainly in this area, about, we're asking kids to get up at 6 in the morning and show up at school maybe at 7:30, 8 o'clock. Maybe we should think about having them start school later in the name of health, their ability to learn when they get to school. Is that an important issue to take up here? What are kids capable of at 7 in the morning versus 9 in the morning?
I think if you visit any middle or high school at 7 in the morning, you can see that they're capable of very little.
That's right. Although some of them sleep all day, not just in the morning.
But it is important, and it's important to teach them that multitasking and staying up all night to play video games and do their homework and chat on the phone and, text message is not good for their brain health. But they don't seem to realize it. It's almost a challenge. How much more can I actually do? And that makes me better. And I've heard that there's some educational emphasis now on teaching kids to multitask, which is really bad for the brain.
Does anybody know of any real serious research that says that the later school day starts, the better?
Yes. So there was a randomized control trial done, I think it's a randomized control trial done several years ago in one of the states where counties or schools, high schools, changed their start dates, start times, and made them much later. And what they were able to show is traffic fatalities went down in the areas around them because students were driving differently, doing different work, and so forth. It made a big difference there. There's also a randomized control trial done with 6th graders, not so much with the start time, but with sleep. And what they did was to get several classes of 6th graders with, I don't know how they did this, but with help with the parents, to have the students go to bed an hour earlier or an hour later. And so they randomized the conditions, and so some of those lucky kids were kept up late at night watching tunes or whatever it was, and some of them were probably miserable but were sent to bed an hour earlier. So there was a 2-hour difference. What they found after just a few weeks, I think it was something like only 4 weeks, they found something like a 1.5 year difference in cognitive capability. So think about that, right? We're all so worried about our kids' educational performance and what can we do, and we're ready to spend millions on interventions and work and all this. If you can just get them to sleep an extra hour, you get an extra year of learning performance? I mean, so this is extraordinary stuff. That doesn't mean it's easy. Any of us who have kids know how hard that is. But there are real potentials like this, and there is some real evidence out there to help guide this kind of thing.
Well, it occurs to me, why hasn't it guided policy?
That's a broader question, right? There's a ton of learning science that has built up over decades now with very specific guidance. We haven't even started to talk about technology yet, but very specific guidance about how you use technology to hurt learning and how you use technology to help learning. And randomized controlled trials done in multiple centers, just waiting to be used at scale. No one is using it. Not universities, not school systems, not publishers. We're doing it inside my organization, Kaplan, because I'm able to do that, but it's not, yes, where is the news? Where is the information? Where is the demand? Right? People who are in the business of creating materials, why would they spend on this kind of work if they don't need it to sell? So on the buying side, people who are buying for their kids or their schools, they're not demanding this, even though they could. Has your materials been built using Richard Mayer's multimedia principles? Let's try an experiment. Who here knows who Richard Mayer is? Okay, there's like one.
Architect?
No, not the architect.
Okay.
Sorry. We got that. Okay. Who? Again, sorry. Hands up, just to wake you all up. Who here knows who Eric Clapton is? Eric Clapton. Oh, you're laughing. Okay. Who here knows that Eric Clapton is a rock guitarist? Okay, look around. Okay. Who here is a rock guitarist? Yeah, there's always somebody. Okay, so what we've proved is you do not have to be a rock guitarist to know one of the world's best rock guitarists. Richard Mayer is literally the world's most cited learning scientist. He is the Eric Clapton of learning science research. And nobody in this room who presumably is interested in education and learning knows who he is. So it's no wonder nobody's asking, are your materials built using Richard Mayer's multimedia principles that have been validated over decades across many different labs and many different experiments? So the great question is, well, why not? What's missing here? It's a good question.
Yes.
So it's interesting that we bring up the shifting school times because it's I live in a school district that's wrestling with that right now, Montgomery County.
Montgomery County,
Yeah.
right.
So one of the things that I've found interesting is that I've been advocating for this, and I thought, it seemed obvious. And I was delighted to see that there seemed to be a school board and a superintendent that were really willing to say, let's investigate, not even understanding completely what the bottom line was going to be for them until they get it all worked out, which I think is probably the biggest inhibitor in the beginning. It's just in terms of transportation and all of the headaches that costs and what is the real cost of that. But what's really become interesting is that not everybody agrees on this, including the kids, which surprised me. So kids who are involved in certain extracurricular activities, for example, like the way that regimen has functioned for them, and they like the way that it works, and they don't want to mess with it.
Well, let me suggest that it's not unlike the idea of extending the school year. It's inconvenient for adults.
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the issue here, that brain research and all the knowledge you all have gets in the way of adult schedules, or gets in the way of the way we've been doing things for the last 200 years.
Yep.
Well, the other thing is, our intuitive models of learning, which we usually get because of how we were taught, are often wrong. But how would we know that? And so people think it's fine, or even think that there's a certain, character-based thing that says they should get up. Why should they sleep?
Early to bed, early to
They ought to
rise.
be up, right? I mean, I grew up in a household a bit like that, and so. But the learning science stuff doesn't inform that. It's more of a cultural thing. The convenience issue is tricky. Yeah.
Dr. Gamino, you talked about multitasking and how that's not a good idea. But I can bet that there are people who argue that our kids' brains today can handle that. And we all have seen, including our kids, the kid who's on the cell phone, also on a laptop, listening to music with some other gadget, and doing at least 3, maybe 4 things at a time. And I've always been tempted to say, well, did you read the book that you were supposed to read? Did you finish the book? Says, yeah, Dad, I did. But all I see is you just fooling around with all this music and all these gadgets. And I said, tell me what the book said. She told me what the book said. And I'm amazed. Now, multitasking in this context of education, you say, is damaging to children? How so?
We don't know for sure that it's damaging, but we presume that it is because we know from MRI studies that you don't actually focus on many things at once. It's your brain switching back and forth, which takes away cognitive resources. So you really need to be more focused in order to get the most out of learning.
Let's marry that to the question about technology, though. I mean, this technology that we have at our disposal is so extraordinary. You wonder what they're going to do next, what we're going to be doing in a year or two. How does the technology issue play into the multitasking issue?
So there's there's some thinking in evolutionary biology right now that our brain is in the midst of a lurch forward in evolution. And part of it has to do with the way we now have access to practically any information. We all do research of any type spontaneously throughout the day on our cell phones or at a computer. And part of what I think is so intriguing is that, yes, I think there is a loss of deep, slow reading, thinking habits, but there may be a new set of skills that kids are naturally adapting to that we don't fully understand. And the reason that I think this way, and I don't have very good science to back it up, but if you think, for example, the quotes of Steve Jobs, who says that innovation and imagination is really just putting 2 ideas together and making new associations. And part of, I think, what we're able to do now is be in the middle of something and go, oh, wait, what was that guy's name again? Richard Mayer. I think he has something to do with what I'm doing right now. I can go there for a minute and I can bring it back. That's a different set of habits and skills that maybe we're not understanding how to teach and how to habituate in the right way. But I think there's potential there that may at least balance and offset in some ways of what we're losing in the old way that our brains used to interact with the information that was at our disposal.
Another way to think about this technology business is technology really doesn't do anything for learning at all. And that sounds a little shocking, but Richard Clark from 20 years ago is a very well-known learning scientist. He's kind of like Eric Clapton again. He's not that Dick Clark, though, not the rock and roll. But he wrote a piece back in the late 70s where he drew an analogy. He said, technology is to learning the way a delivery truck is to nutrition. Okay, so think about that. Yeah, if we have jet airplanes bringing fruits and vegetables from South America, we can improve nutrition. But we're not confused that we're eating the jet planes, right? The jet planes are bringing us things that are nutritious. And often in the discussions about technology, we get confused and we think it's the iPhone that's lifting learning. It's not. These technologies provide the potential of tremendous new ways to do learning well. But they also can create trouble. I mean, imagine your worst ever college professor. That person could only damage a few thousand students a year. With technology, he can hurt millions. Okay? Millions. He's a weapon of mass destruction now. Okay? So that's not a win, right? It's not a win. At the same time, the technology can let you do the kinds of association pieces, the kind of personalization at scale that teachers just can't do with classes of 30 and 40. So the trick is to get the learning problems right and the brain problems right, and then tie your technology to make those things more affordable, reliable, available, and so forth. And that's the trick, I think, with the technology, is get the learning first and then connect it through technology to some students. Does that sound right to you?
I think that's right, but I think then, again, that's retraining teachers to ask the right questions to get kids to think deeper about information rather than just the shallow, what date did this happen? But why did it happen? And how does it connect with current events?
So, this would not be good news for parents with children at home, but at MIT, where they have these computerized classes now, where the so-called flipped classrooms one hears about, and they can measure when do undergraduates want to look at a lecture that they don't attend but they see online. And they want the average favorite time for undergraduates is 2 a.m. in the morning, with the lecture run at twice the speed of the speaker. And so, so on the one hand, this is really, I mean, is that empowering education because you're on their time cycle truly, and at the rate of processing truly, or is that going to be something dangerous in terms of a shallow processing? And we need to understand that as deeply as we can, because as you pointed out, I think the education is moving, the technology is moving so fast that if we don't figure these things out, we can have a really misled generation.
The technology to learning what delivery truck to nutrition, it sounded like an SAT question.
I'm Kaplan, what do you expect?
That's right. I want to dig a little deeper into this multitasking thing. Is it that we're talking about, and technology, is it that technology or particular gadgets hurt our attention span? Is that what we're talking about?
No, I think in a way, the brain works the way it has for tens of thousands of years. There's not enough time yet for evolution to actually kick in, right? So it has always been able to do multiple things at once. That's a great thing. And to be distracted by multiple things at once. The way working memory really works to learn and get better is it has to be focused, and so you have to clear space. When we did some analysis of some of the best test takers at Kaplan Test Prep, what we found is to study, they would shut off all their technology so that they could actually focus on a single thing they were working on. And it wasn't the technology that was kind of a problem, it was the distraction of the tweet thing going off, the email note going off. And they themselves knew, this is hard, I've got to focus. So I don't think it's not a problem of technology, it's the problem of if you want to get better at something, you've got to have enough cognitive space to do deliberate practice, to think deeply about it. And the constant pinging of things doesn't let you focus on getting better at something. You can actually do a lot of things, but not get better at any one thing. Does that sound right to you guys? That's the challenge, right?
That's exactly what it is.
Let's begin winding this down. Before we go to our Q&A, we just got back, my colleagues and I, from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Dr. Deborah Phillips of Georgetown had done this pretty interesting study of preschool. And the term that kept coming up, and I know it's become an issue in the promotion of the Common Core standards, is this term developmentally appropriate. Give me your definition of what that is for the layperson, all of you. Beginning with you, Dr. Gamino. What is that?
Well, developmentally appropriate is doing things that push children to a certain level, but don't frustrate them because the level is too high. So there are certain things and certain questions you can ask a child who's in 7th and 8th grade that you may not be able to challenge a 6th grader with because it's just too difficult for their brain development, because the brain is undergoing massive changes during that pre-adolescent time all the way through the 20s. So it's important to challenge children but not frustrate them. So it's really being in tune with the child and where they are.
Doesn't that depend on the child?
It can develop, yes, it does to some degree, but there's also some generalities we can make from research and what we know about how the brain develops.
Dr. Gabriele?
So, I mean, we would all want something to be developmentally appropriate. We wouldn't want to give a kindergartner the test of a high school senior, right? That would be hopeless and not. But what I think is, if we don't have a real partnership between education in a deep way, educators in a deep way in the school systems and researchers, we'll never even know what the answer to that is. Because what we tend to do in research is we do a snapshot study. We thank everybody involved and report our results. And what we need are, deep partnerships with education systems like public school systems that say, oh, well, we thought this curriculum was developmentally appropriate. Let's see what this child is doing in 5 years. Let's see what this child goes to college. And so through randomized kinds of trials or through tracking children, really discover objectively, because otherwise we can have debates amongst ourselves. I think that's developmentally appropriate, I don't. But how are we going to know this in a way that will fuel better education?
Dr. Saxberg.
So when I think about developmentally appropriate, I think about two things that need to be matched to the child. One is the learning challenge has got to take advantage of what they've already mastered, but not have so many new things that they can't focus on it. So that's one wing. And the other wing is the motivation to learn this has been sufficiently matched to the kid's own motivational structure, right? What motivates a 35-year-old to master something is not going to be the same as a 6-year-old. And so I think those two things, both motivation and the cognitive structure of what you're learning, if you match them, then you have something that's developmentally appropriate.
Dr. Brown.
So I think we're all somewhat touching on the old Csikszentmihalyi sense of flow thing, where you balance being challenged with being overwhelmed and being in that sort of surfing the wave at that perfect point. And I think the tangible example that I can think of, it's not in a school, but it's definitely a learning setting, and it definitely is this issue. I see Dr. Tom Kelly from the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, which is it's a healthcare facility that uses integrative care to treat TBI and psychological health issues for service members. And we've been partnering with them to bring arts interventions, creative arts interventions, as part of an integrative care modality. And one of the things that became very important for us to understand was, how do we invite these guys who have no training in writing to sit down and write about their own worldview? And what we found, and what I've learned so much from them, is that we really have to be listening to them and understand how we can set this up in a way that they feel like they can pick up the pen and actually do it. And when they do, they write stuff that's as good as anything that I run into anywhere, because they have their own, what a piece of work is a man issue. So I think it's something this is another really sticky, wicked challenge for policy, because unless you're in the room listening and watching, how do you set that standard in a way that's actually going to be organically right in the room? And I think another thing that comes up a lot is, how do you build a way to standardize these things and scale them out, while also allowing teachers in the room to actually bring their own creative and innovative skills into play?
Let me tell you what I came across as a reporter and told our colleagues. For all the good intentions and teachers trying to look into the research, there was an instance in which I asked, so how do you deal with kids who don't know English in the preschool program? It's a terrific program. And well, some of these kids are the more likely to be held back. And then I heard a teacher say, no, that's often a mistake. Because children, when it comes to language acquisition, are like little sponges. So I'm baffled by that. By the view, first of all, that we need to somehow shield them, protect them, keep them back, because they need more of something. Versus this idea that these kids are capable of, certainly when it comes to language, learning English. Most of these kids are Spanish-speaking. The Latino community has grown by leaps and bounds in Tulsa. So you have these two different views in the same school. Who's right?
Well, language learning is a bit different than some other kinds of learning for little kids. And so you have to draw a distinction between little kids and older kids. Because for little kids, we all as human beings have this machinery to acquire a language by being immersed in it. And so it's great to get them immersed and get them going that way. And so it just works a little bit differently that way. So the more immersed they are, I mean, the faster they'll actually pick up the languages for the little people. As you get to be older, after you're teenagers and so forth, you lose that automated capability to bring the language in, and then you need much more formal practice, formal work, just like any of us would to pick up another language. So it works actually differently. And I think there's a myth there about that.
Yeah, what we found with English language learners is that they have to be very conceptual because our language is difficult to learn, especially as teenagers. And so if you can teach them more holistically, they do better and they gain confidence. Whereas if you break it down and make it not challenging enough, then they are stymied. And they're frustrated too because it's not that they're not intelligent, it's just that they don't speak the language. And younger children, of course, just immersion is really the best antidote for not being able to speak English.
So I think this in some ways gets back to the Boston study. Perhaps the concern for the person who feels like they need to be held back is a concern that they won't test well and that the school's scores then don't reflect.
One of those adult priorities, I'm sure.
One of those adult priorities, and there may be funding tied to it and all kinds of things. And if that's the case, then that's wrong. But there is likely, as you sort of alluded to, there's likely some cognitive skills happening in this person who has one language and is now being immersed in a second one that may actually be a really important skill that's happening in the room and not being captured or measured.
Let me come back to poor kids. And again, use the Tulsa example. What happens when, and we all agreed that the family and that setting and the availability of books and parents reading to their kids and providing all kinds of resources is important. When it comes to poor kids, though, we ran into one case. My colleague, Eric Westervelt, followed a parent with some serious emotional, mental health issues. So much so that her kitchen burned down because she had a memory lapse. And she'd never finished high school, I think went up only through 8th grade. When you have a child living under those circumstances with a parent who doesn't have the wherewithal, not just the resources, but their mental health is at issue, what happens? Is that child at risk? And how much can a school or any of the research that you've done compensate if you put that child in the right setting, in a school setting? What do we do about those kids growing up in these circumstances?
I think we challenge them. We
Challenge
the students, and we teach them skills that help them problem solve, help them think in a broader manner.
When you say we, though, who are we talking about? We challenge them.
We train teachers to do that, to understand that poverty is not an academic death sentence, that children in poverty can improve their thinking abilities and their learning abilities, and that it's not impossible, and that education is the way out. That's the most important aspect, I think.
It's also one of the reasons some of the very successful academic models like KIPP or Achievement First and Amistad and others, they have long days, and that allows a real culture around learning to envelop the student when they're there, because you may not be able to get that outside, but while they're there, and you have a lot going on that reinforces that all through the day. And that's a way of, if you will, inoculating, helping those students with real awareness by the teachers that this is an important thing to be done, just as you were saying, to get it done. At the same time, I think it's also wrong to sort of give up on parents. They really are critical resources, and they're going to vary about what they can do, but you want to try to bring them in and make sure they understand what they can do and have resources to do it with, while not allowing that to be the only support those students get outside their formal academics. Try to expand to have more resources. And some of these school systems that stay open, they bring everybody in. They get the family in. So everybody shows up for lessons, for learning, for services. And I think that's the way to get it to try to make those changes stick in the students as well.
And so many of those parents want the kids to drop out of high school so they can help support the family. And not understanding that the way to pull yourself out of poverty is to get an education. And so parents need more education as well.
And with that, this is a wrap. We're going to go to Q&A now. First of all, a round of applause for our panelists. So please go to the mic if you have a question. I'm going to reserve my right to ask the first one, which is maybe somewhat prickly. What are the politics of brain research? I mean, the president has proposed $75 billion to expand preschool, for example. Well, that's caught up in politics. Doesn't make difference whether it makes sense or not. It's politics. School reforms, Common Core, entangled in politics because people believe that it's a federal dictate, that it's Big Brother. I mean, no matter what, it's politics. Doesn't matter whether Common Core is good or not. Is there some degree of politics that's a problem for the work you all do?
Of course.
Who's behind the politics? What's the disagreement in these politics?
It's people coming into the political scene with varying backgrounds and varying understandings of the needs of the school and the children and the needs of the developing brain. I think most definitely we need to inform policymakers of what the brain needs to be successful in school.
In other words, they're kind of clueless?
I didn't say that.
Well, I did.
I think there's, somebody who does most of my research is brain measurement and relating that to how the mind works. And I think there's a concern sometimes that, you can, if you see brain differences associated with poverty, easy to show, as they are on test scores, easy to show, that, there's a sort of biological determinism that you're measuring. People have the intuition that way. And we know that, the brain is phenomenally plastic. I mean, this conference is a lot about that. And so I think that's an important message for scientists and educators to, keep sending that message so that as we understand more about brain difference associated with learning difficulties or with unlucky environmental situations, that we know that the brain can change fantastically with the right kind of support. And so we need those kinds of stunning brain pictures, to encourage people to say, no, it's not a brain that's unlucky and life has to play out. It's a brain that, needs the support of society to flourish.
I think it's been something that I've been thinking a lot about because the pressures and the pushback can come from two extreme different viewpoints politically. And I think on the one hand, there can be a discomfort when you think that you're reducing things like consciousness and the way my soul thinks to mere biology, and that I'm not much different than a tapeworm in that sense. And I think that can be something that very intelligent people can not, embrace very tightly, very quickly. And then on the other side, even from the art sectors, you can feel a sense that we need to preserve the nobility of the arts for art's sake. And kind of in the same way that if you're just reducing thought processes to molecular activity, where's the magic? My favorite response to that, Eric Kandel, here's a rock star of science that I'm absolutely, in love with. And he's been working with memory and brain, and he's been in the conversations with the Brain Initiative. And he said that I think Sandy mentioned this earlier too, we've really made some advances in heart research, and we understand a lot more about the heart. There were similar issues in the beginning there, but just because we now understand it's functioning better doesn't make it less magical, and I think that's going to be true for brain research as well.
I'd add one thing to it. Agreeing with all of this, I have to use the word money, There is so much money that is invested in educating our children, educating our students, educating in universities. As soon as you have these giant flows of money, you're going to have politics. It is sometimes remarkable how local school politics is determined by the building contractors who are on the school board. Because they're on there, they love their children too, but there's another reason why they're on the school board. And so there's a whole lot of this money stuff that can create the usual stresses within political systems. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily different than military or other things, but it just has to be said. That's part of what creates the confusion in the conversation.
Let's go to our first question from our audience. Please tell us who you are and your question, and if you want to direct it to anyone in particular.
Okay. My name is Jim Parks. My question has to do with the amygdala. It's the elephant in the room, for lack of a better term. And my question really is looking at, in today's society, we have technology that young people are embracing, yet it's bringing the entire world into their living room. And the impact it has on the amygdala is one that I think we need to address from a policy standpoint. I wanted to get all of your opinions. Thank you.
So when you're speaking about the amygdala, it's a part of the brain that has a lot to do with emotional control and emotions and anger, and it's a very primitive part of the brain. And so, you know, in some ways, I don't think the issues are different for the amygdala than they are for any other part of the brain. How do people react and deal with floods of new information as they come in? And I think it's just what you might expect, is we've got to give context, we've got to give structure, we've got to try to use evidence-based things where there is evidence to help people make sense of what comes in, rather than emotion or myths. And then finally, be sensitive to multiple ways to interpret this, right? Different cultures seeing the same image of a woman's face. Some will think it's a sin, some will think that's very nice, some will think, what a bad hair day she's having. And, you know, that's a cultural reaction, right? And I think all our students and us, as we look at an image and react ourselves with our amygdala, and et cetera, we got to realize others are going to react with anger or, you know, criticism or whatever too. And we have to teach kids that. I don't know, sorry.
I was just, you know, the amygdala has a couple of functions that you mentioned, and I do think there's an interesting question about whether we have to grapple with increasing stressful pressures on children who are not ready for that kind of stress. You know, forever our species was dealing with, you know, running away from predators, right? That was the kind of stress, right? And now they have this, you know, everything from college admissions, information they're not ready to process, all the way down through the system. And on the one hand, I think it's a terrific goal that we have. We want every child to succeed, to a maximum extent that they can, and that's a great societal value. On the other hand, you know, that's a stress for many people who were not cared for so well before. It wasn't a societal value before, right? So when we see these stunning numbers, 1 out of 11 children with ADHD, now we're 1 out of 42 boys with autism diagnoses. You know, we just know that there's, that's the most recent number from the CDC, 1 out of 42. So, you know, where are the pressures that are happening on children's minds and brains in a world that they were never evolved to deal with? And I'm agreeing with you that completely, that they're getting all these things coming into their home, things they hear from their friends that were inconceivable. And so I do think we have to think about that sort of social, emotional pressure that children are under, and see that as part of, you know, how we need to think about supporting students and families.
So he may be surprised to hear this, but I think if we look to Aristotle, he may help us a little bit here. Aristotle is someone I've been fascinated with because he was really a man of medicine first. Then he wrote the book on poetry. And it's been argued quite a bit over the centuries, but some of the recent thinking on what he meant by catharsis is bringing intellectual clarity to emotional chaos. And I think if we, you know, all of this stuff is happening so fast and it's all available, but if we bring sense-making and meaning-making as part of the activities that we continue to put in front of kids or help lead them to habituate towards, then I think that this again gets into imagination and arts. I think when you think about the arts, and this is looping back to what Libby was talking about, babies making sense of noise. And there's research that's emerging that our impulse towards music is really about building language ability. And that's just a bunch of noise, a bunch of white noise that is turned into melody and then is turned into words, and then it makes sense. And I think you can, Sorry Starry Night was a bunch of visual information that then was turned into this thing that meant something to that artist and to all of us that look at it.
Let's go to the question here at my left.
Shireen Adebaki here.
I'm sorry, could you start over there?
Hi, I'm Dr. Shireen Adebaki from Children's National Medical System here in Washington, D.C. And I'm a researcher and a PI and a parent of a learning disabled child here at the Lab School of Washington. I loved your presentations and your thoughtfulness about education and learning. And thank you, Sandy, for what a wonderful, wonderful lineup. This is incredible. It's really an honor to sit here in the audience today. I'm a concussion researcher, so I'm so excited that I even, got to be here at this session. My daughter wants to be a pediatrician. I'm a pediatrician, and she has severe learning disabilities. And I've kind of started discouraging her initially, but now I'm looking at, just not for her, but for also disadvantaged children in inner cities and learning disabled children, looking at options to engage them in health technology and knowledge translation, things they're good at, Instagram, those sort of things, to get some skills, to get some mastery to help them in the future. I loved your concept of the learning engineer, Dr. Bror and Dr. Gabrielli. When is that going to become a reality? And when are mindful measures of true learning and capabilities going to replace SATs? Love to.
Anybody from the College Board?
Let's see. So when will there be lots of learning engineers hard at work with a shingle out that you could go talk to? That may take more than a year. That's going to take a while. I think one of the neat things about technology and what it's doing on its best days is to start to generate more rich evidence that people are now aware, they call it big data, that they need to mine and look at. So soon they'll finish just being, splashing around it and thinking how cool this is and realize they still don't know what's going on and they got to figure out what to do with it, and that will lead them back to science and now much more able to answer those questions. I think that will accelerate more of this, and since big data comes from large groups of students, that may create, great intersections. On the testing side, there actually is now a lot of work going on trying to make much better tests, much more rich and complex tasks with multiple parts. And the interesting thing is, if you have an electronic practice engine that is well designed, just simply watching the flow of a student's practice and how much they ask for help, how long it takes them, you'll actually get a more accurate picture of that student's skills than by giving them a single assessment at the end. So I think even electronic practice engines, when they're well built, that give complex problems and what do you do next, and here are the results, and now what do you do, those can also improve these, you put it well, these mindfulness measures. Whether they'll get used for college admissions, that's going to be a while. There's some industry around that too, I have to say. So.
And we've developed a program called SMART, which stands for Strategic Memory Advanced Reasoning Training, which takes students step by step to help them understand the metacognitive skills that they need to problem solve and be creative. So we've had a lot of success with that, and I think there's a lot of need for that in many, many cases, not just learning disabled kids, but many kids need that kind of program.
Yeah, I think that a huge challenge in front of us, and a terribly important one, is our learning differences, which, as you pointed out, can extend for many different environmental or genetic or happenstance reasons. And that's where one thing is, I think we need more science on that to really say which child will benefit from which kind of support. That's just shockingly little science about that. And then second, that's where technology, one might imagine, could make a tremendous difference, because that could be so much adaptable on a scale. The asterisk out there, right, is the technology eliminates a bit of the social aspects of learning, and we know that that's a hugely important thing. So how to balance that technology flexibility with still the socio-emotional growth of any child, I think will be a challenge for us. But all of a sudden, it's an interesting challenge because we have some tools to really go after it.
One more thing I'd add, just from a policy standpoint, we've got to figure out how to break the calendar. right? In other words, now we have this, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year thing, which is silly. Minds don't build themselves over 1 year time frames. What we really need, again, with technology's help, is competency-based learning. I mean, none of you know whether any of us graduated when we were 17, 18, 19 from high school, and I hope none of you care, right? So it's not about a race, it's about developing competence. And a bunch of the research says, with enough deliberate practice, you can reach competence. Some go faster, some go slower. So that actually really opens things up. You're not a failure if you reach competence and it takes you longer. That's not failure, you've achieved competence. So I think that's another piece of the policy puzzle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Viati, and I'm a STEM and sometimes STEAM educator with NASA. And I'm also interested in the concept of being the learning engineer. In listening to the discussion, I heard a little bit about automated knowledge and habits of mind and practice, which seem like very fixed concepts or things that we might want to harden for students in terms of some of their skill bases, while we're also trying to unleash creativity and innovation. And it seems paradoxical, but I'm wondering if there are skills or sets of skills from a brain-based perspective that you all would say we should harden to allow that, or is at a headier level that question kind of wrong, and that even habits of mind should be plastic?
Well, I actually like your quote, the Stephen Jobs idea, that a lot of research work on innovation suggests most of it is what the French call bricolage, where you put together different things in creative ways. But what's interesting is you actually have to have them rattling around in your head to begin with. So part of this there's no way around the yin-yang of you've got to master some things so they're ready to be just, that's like this other thing in this other domain. You can't get that from Google. You can't look up what in the world is like this thing I'm now looking at. Right? It doesn't work that way, right? You can't put a webcam and say, Google, what is this like? That's what minds do. But that means you've got to stock the mind with a lot of information and skills that are really under the hood, that are really now non-conscious. And at the same time, I think you have to practice how you do that mixing of things. There's research on concept development and the principle, how do you learn principles, general guidelines to apply to solve problems. It's very clear the practice has to be about try it in one situation, try it in a completely different situation, try it in a third situation. And that practice and feedback and struggle begins to build, it does apply in all these, and you get used to that. But I think rather than settling it, we have to embrace that our minds need both of these things. Stuff that's wired in, and then that working memory flexibility that needs its own practice to develop. There's no way around this.
And that's what we've found, that it's so important to teach those higher order thinking skills, to teach children to be critical, teach them how to associate two very disparate ideas and bring them together, how to collaborate with one another and bounce ideas off of each other. That's all important to that thinking process. Because I learned a lot just this morning from my collaborators here on the panel. And it sparks ideas for me as well. So I think teaching children how important that is, that's a job, a career success as well, being able to collaborate and listen to your peers and gather ideas and then associate them. But it's all involved with the frontal lobe. I know we had the question about the amygdala. The amygdala is very important, but if we're not building frontal lobe connections, then the amygdala takes over. And that's what happens with teenage brains, is the amygdala develops earlier, and so they're very emotional at that age, but they need to start developing the ability to reason and problem solve and think at a deeper level.
Let's go to this question on the left.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Locke from ARP, and I was wondering for each of our panelists, I've heard it said that each generation is smarter than the last. I was wondering if you think that that's true, or do you think it's accumulated knowledge that somehow we're able to receive by the generations? And if you do believe each generation is smarter than the last, what does that say about what we should be doing for education for the future?
So you're referring to the famous Flynn Effect. IQ goes up worldwide 3 points every decade. So by that measure, the world is getting smarter, which is, and therefore we have no problems to solve because
the work here is done.
I'll just say one, so partly that reflects, I think, relative growth worldwide in things like nutrition, not nearly where we want to be, but, improvements. But a lot of it turns out to be specifically gains in what we call abstract thinking. So Flynn has analyzed the data. So that's what we're talking a lot about today, because this world, teaching to the test at the whole planet level, the whole planet is moving to this abstract level thinking for careers and jobs. I mean, different places, different rates, but that's where the world is going. And so, that's why we have this educational challenge, which is if you need abstract thinking, problem solving, lots of stuff in working memory, didn't used to be the problem. Now that's a challenge in front of us, but a doable challenge in terms of brain and education, but a new one. Not reading and writing, but also sort of thinking. It's really exciting.
And if you think about it, IQ tests were developed many, many years ago, and so we haven't kept up in order to really measure what it is that we're doing better. So maybe we're not getting better, maybe we're actually getting worse. But according to, when was the Stanford Binet? This is pretty old.
20s, 30s.
Yeah. So, we have more information. If it's just a measure of the information that we have, then of course kids are much more knowledgeable because they're exposed to much more information. But that doesn't mean they know how to deal with that information and think about it at a deeper level.
I would just add, semiconductors obey Moore's law, but neurons do not. Right? So semiconductors' capacity double every 18 months. We got nothing like that going on in our heads. So, we shouldn't be assuming that somehow our machinery is going to save us from the problem of educating ourselves. We got the machinery we got. It's not going to change dramatically over the next couple of years or decades or whatever it is. So we just have to get this done and understand more deeply how this machinery works and align the learning and diagnostics and personalization better with it, I think.
I'd say that in my mind there's a big question on this, and I wonder if we're becoming generally better at testing. So then the IQ test starts to become something that we're ready to take. And I just think about my dad, high school education, fought in Korea, didn't go to college, he was a farmer. I don't know how he'd do on an IQ test, but he was a fencer, he was a welder, he was a machinist. The amount of things that he was expert in, geneticist, we had a herd of pigs that only we had for very specific reasons. That wouldn't show up in an IQ test, and I don't know how many, I don't have all of that, and so I'm not sure if we're all getting smarter or we're all just better at expecting the kinds of questions that we see on these tests.
Yes.
Good morning, thank you. Intriguing discussion. Jim McLean, your Air Force Medical Support Agency. As we've talked this morning and I've listened to you discuss the topics, I've seen several themes that have popped up, and really it seems like the discussion is centered around the difference between knowledge and skills versus motivation and inspiration, learning versus the application of learning or wisdom, thinking versus critical thinking. Those seems like a key theme. We're trying to get to the right side of that equation where we're more critical and in my time in the military, over many years, I've often asked people what is that makes the difference in their lives, what has caused them to get where they're at. And by the way, the military is a great melting pot. We have people across all cultures, across all levels of income. And there's been a constant theme, and that has been the effect of interpersonal relationships and individual resiliency based on spiritual, mental, and physical balance. What are your thoughts? Because in relation to the importance of interpersonal relationships and that resiliency to true learning, to transitioning from just knowledge to wisdom, from thinking to critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. I think that, and I was wanting to insert this earlier, I suspect that when we look at, for example, the arts research that shows kids that have been deeply involved in arts engagement or arts training close the gap, I think a lot of it has to do with the social interaction and the kind of resiliency that builds. it puts you in a position, whether you're expressing yourself musically or in a play or drawing a painting, you are making sense of this. This is your stamp on it, and now you're sharing it with other people, and it becomes an interaction, and it becomes a sort of contextualized interaction. This is the way the world sounds to me, or looks to me, and I think that builds a kind of confidence in a self confidence and sense of self that allows you maybe to weather all kinds of different things in a way that maybe is a little more elastic.
At the same time, I don't think this too requires training, education, practice. There's actually work by David Yeager looking at students going to underprivileged students going to high-end universities, showing that they will often interpret things that happen at the university as an attack on themselves and messaging that they don't belong there. And you can get over it by explaining to the students, no, everyone is treated badly at university. It's not you. They don't care about anybody here. So let's get busy, right? Let's get busy. And then you work on strategies, and you find that literally, I'm not kidding here, a few hours of that kind of training in the first semester, randomized controlled trial, leads to significantly increased graduation rates 4 years later. And it's because it's self-reinforcing, right? So you shouldn't assume that if you just get them together, it'll go well. It is hard work to work with other people you don't know. And so some training on how to get good at that allows that to become part of your toolkit as well. And then you can begin to learn from that.
Right, can I just respond to that too? And this also gets at something that comes up a lot when we talk about integrated learning. Sometimes it's arts integration or just some of the integrated learning that happens across disciplines. And this is a good point. The training has to be real, it has to be high quality, and it has to be a skill set that's developed with competence. It doesn't just, your math teacher teaching you your music class because we're integrating learning becomes a cost-saving thing, but it may not achieve the kinds of things that I'm alluding to here.
We have less than 5 minutes. Time for one more question. You're welcome to approach the panelists afterwards, but let's go to our last question here.
This one is actually from our audience watching in Dallas. They want to know, in your discussion of learning, you didn't really address homework. What are your viewpoints on that?
So homework, to me, goes in the category of practice and feedback, right? So the question is, well, under what conditions should you be doing practice and feedback? And it is very clear that for some families, doing practice and feedback at home is terrific because you've got support structures, people turn off the television, there's space for you to work, all kinds of stuff. So literally work at home is terrific. In other cases, especially families that we're most worried about, working at home is a disaster. There is no space. It's too distracting. And so you actually need to work elsewhere rather than at home. But that general notion of, gosh, I can't just sit in class, I've got to do deliberate practice, that is essential. 80% of what a learner is doing needs to be their own production, their own attempt to get stuff done, not sitting and listening. And in some areas, it's harder to get than others. So in that sense, it's essential, the personal productivity and getting feedback on it. I don't know.
Yeah, there's really compelling evidence, both for computerized learning and for regular homework, that test taking, now not in the sense of standardized tests, but content specific for your course, is really one of the most powerful ways to learn. And homework kind of embeds testing yourself, so to speak. Do you know the material, understand the material? So it's a very powerful device, but it has to be supported. And just recently, I also read articles that if your parents help you too much on the other end of the spectrum, it's not good either. So you got to have your parents make a nice home environment, but not kind of do your work for you, because then the homework is less powerful also. Yeah.
So this gets me thinking about, it kind of goes back to my last response, but the notion of the 1,000-hour theory where 10,000 hours, where I was in a lazier band than the Beatles. So the idea that the Beatles spent 10,000 hours on this, and then they became the Beatles, and that they've looked at other people who have done similar things. But some of the sustained thinking around this is, yes, if it was very highly attentive, and if you were entering into with full force and full attention. If you were doing it in a sloppy way, it could create bad habits, and I find that to be very true in the arts. I mean, something can end up being a very good play or not, depending on how focused everybody is in every moment of the rehearsal.
And that's where feedback's so important. And if students are just doing homework for the sake of doing homework and never getting feedback, then that's an issue too, because they could be doing things completely wrong.
Well, and the feedback, a key thing about feedback is it's got to be feedback the student acts on.
Right.
There's research in writing showing that merely getting a grade on it and then throwing it in the drawer, it does not improve writing performance any more than just keeping writing. But if you get the feedback on a draft and you are required to incorporate it, now you're doing deliberate practice. You're actually thinking about what the heck did this mean, and that accelerates your performance. And that's true in all kinds of things. It's not just feedback, I actually have to use it to try again. It's a critical piece of this. So.
Use you can use. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. That's a wrap. Thank you again.